Welcome to the Employment Law and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 190 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment solicitor and HR specialist, and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where together with my colleagues, we provide advice and assistance to both employers and employees on all aspects of employment law. In this week's episode of the podcast, I'm going to be covering off a topic that arises fairly often when I'm advising employers and managers and HR managers as well, and that is in relation to how you handle difficult conversations. One of the critical things of being a manager or running a team or dealing with HR is to be able to communicate well with people, and sometimes we can run into difficulty when we have a particularly emotive issue to deal with. So hopefully you'll find this episode helpful and give you some tools and tips. So without further ado, I'm going to get into this week's featured content. So whilst this episode of the podcast isn't covering anything legal or anything set in stone, it really is just my advice and my views on experience over a number of years. What I would say about handling difficult conversations is that in every single case that I can think of that I have dealt with that has ended up in an employment tribunal dispute, if you really drill down into it, you can track back to a time when there was an error in relation to communication amongst one or more people that has then spiraled and caused the end result being the employment tribunal. So it often is the case, actually I would say in more cases than not, that it's either a lack of communication or miscommunication or misunderstanding that starts things off, that sparks the initial issue that then results in the employment tribunal claim. So how you approach difficult conversations and the way in which you address issues can impact obviously not only on the individual and in relation to the team morale and performance, but also it can impact in relation to preventing disputes from getting out of control. So hopefully you'll find some value in this. And as I say, it is just my own thoughts and opinions based on experience. So what is a difficult conversation? Let's start with what is a difficult conversation. It might go without saying, you understand what it is, but it's one whose subject matter is potentially contentious and or sensitive, and which may elicit strong or complex emotions from somebody. And that could be emotions from you or the person that you're discussing the issue with. There are various examples of difficult conversations, and I'm sure you can think of some that you've had to deal with or may be dealing with at the moment. But things like addressing poor performance or underperformance can be particularly difficult. Unacceptable behaviour and issues of attitude, I find, are very difficult to approach with a member of staff or a colleague because it's so personal about them and it's so difficult to pin down to something that's objective. But it can be very difficult to have those kinds of conversations. Obviously, investigating issues of bullying, when you have to turn down an employee request, often we're seeing people having to turn down flexible working requests or holiday requests, and that can be quite a difficult conversation to have. And then dealing with sensitive personal issues. Again, something that comes up really often, surprisingly often, that we're asked about is how do you approach a conversation with an employee who has poor hygiene, poor personal hygiene. And it's those kind of things that people find really hard to address. And hopefully, as I say, by listening to this podcast, I'll give you some tips and hints on how best to address those things. So those are some examples of difficult conversations that you may be facing. And what makes it difficult then, aside from the fact that it can be personal to the individual, there are a number of things which I think make the conversations more difficult for you. And that can be failing to address the issue in a timely manner. What I mean by that is if you let something go for quite some time and then you try to address it, it's become the norm and it can be quite difficult then to approach it. The other thing that can happen is you can often feel resentment because the behaviour's carried on for so long and it's caused you difficulty and you get frustrated, and therefore it makes it much harder to approach that conversation. Then not being honest with the individual can also make it more difficult to address those issues. If you have been misleading or haven't really told them the truth of the issue previously, and then suddenly you're laying all the cards on the table and the individual doesn't think there's any problem because you've led them to believe that everything's okay, then that can make it much more difficult to handle. Of course, having a lack of confidence and inexperience yourself may mean that you have feelings where you're worried about having that conversation, and it can make it much more difficult to approach. And then not having this foundation with your staff of mutual respect and having this inconsistency of behaviour. If you have those things, again, when you try to address a tricky issue, it can make it much more difficult. So I've talked in previous episodes about the importance of really getting to know your team, about being consistent in your behaviour and your communication with them. And if you are laying those foundations as a manager or a supervisor or employer, then it will make approaching difficult issues much easier when you come to deal with them. And there can be many reasons why we might avoid having a difficult conversation. Often it's because we're either worried about it or worried about the person's response. Difficult conversations may elicit strong emotions from the other party that you're worried about. And you might also be worried that if you address the problem, it might open a can of worms that you then have to deal with. It might cause you more work. So there are lots of ways in which we convince ourselves that actually it's better to avoid having those difficult conversations. But of course, there are many dangers if you do. I've talked earlier about the possibility of things going wrong and having employment tribunal claims, but it could also mean that things like poor performance and behaviours become the norm in the organisation or with that person. It can mean that they have an impact on others in the team. So if somebody has got a bad attitude, for example, that can rub off on others over time and causing the whole team morale to drop. Performance can drop and the issues can get worse, of course, if you don't address them. And then, as I was saying earlier, you can have those feelings of frustration and anger sometimes that somebody has continued to behave badly or contrary to how you've asked them to behave if you don't address it. So there are many dangers of avoiding difficult conversations, although we might convince ourselves of the reasons why we shouldn't address it. Actually, when you look into it, the long term could have much more of an impact than addressing the issue in a timely manner at that point. So I have come up with a simple approach to having difficult conversations. And this is how I would approach something if I had to deal with it with an employee or individual. And I think probably this could go for difficult conversations with our personal relationships. Again, often family relationships or friendships, that kind of thing can break down due to either lack of communication or miscommunication. So maybe you can try and use some of these things in your own personal relationships as well. So the first thing I would do when I'm looking at having a difficult conversation is start with, what am I trying to achieve with that conversation? So what is it that you want to achieve? What's the purpose? And what is the outcome you want from it? And try to think about it without the emotion attached to it. I always think there should be a positive outcome, something you want to achieve that is positive out of it. And removing the emotion and keeping it positive will make it much easier for you. So again, thinking back to what you want to say and the issue you want to address and how are you going to get to what you want. So for example, if you have an issue with an employee who has poor personal hygiene at work, the outcome from that is that they have good personal hygiene. And that seems fairly simple, of course, but actually the real outcome of it is that they have better relationships with their colleagues and members of their team and people that they work with, and they present a better image of themselves. So that's a real positive outcome, isn't it? So if you think, I'm approaching this conversation because I want them to have a positive outcome from it, and that is I want them to have an understanding about their personal hygiene so that they can have good positive relationships with colleagues and customers or whatever they're doing, the people around them. The second thing to consider is, what will happen if you do not have the conversation? Again, this will really help you in your approach if you consider what the consequences are if you don't. So write them down and think about, is it something that you've already been avoiding? And should you have dealt with it before? Because I think that's also important when you're approaching the conversation. So in the case of dealing with poor personal hygiene, what will happen if you don't have the conversation is that the individual may become isolated from colleagues because they won't want to be around them, that they may have difficulty in forming relationships at work, and they may also not be fulfilling their potential in relation to their contact with customers, for example, because people don't want to deal with them because they have poor personal hygiene. So the consequences are that they could not be meeting their potential and that it could have an impact on their relationships with colleagues. And then if you really wanted to go further than that and think about what the worst case scenario is that they could then become isolated, which could in turn lead them to feel feelings of maybe that they're being bullied or left out. And then that can have an impact on their mental health, which could in turn impact their performance, and it could lead to them being off sick. So really, if you kind of go all the way through it to the worst case scenario, and then you really hopefully will get to the point where you think, actually, if I don't have this conversation, that could be really bad in the outcome. So ranting on a bit there, but what I would do is the second thing is, after thinking about what you want to achieve, think about what will happen if you don't have the conversation. And then finally, really important, is to think about when and where are you going to have that conversation with them. In my view, the timing of that conversation can be key to delivering the message. And what I mean by that is, when you've thought about what you want to achieve and the positive outcome, think about the best time in which to have that for the most impact, for the least emotional response, and how are you going to address it. So I think that dealing with issues around an employee's attitude, for example, something that could be highly emotive to that individual, particularly if they're not aware that they have an issue, should be dealt with in the morning and not on a Friday afternoon. And the reason I say that is because you want the individual to be around to be able to follow up with you and to keep them occupied and to can maintain that kind of positive communication throughout the day or throughout the week. If you have that kind of conversation last thing on a Friday, what's going to happen is that person's going to go home and stew on it all weekend and build it up and may feel anger, or they may feel sadness, and they may feel shame so that they don't want to come back in on Monday. Whereas if you had that conversation on a Monday morning, for example, then they've got all week to be around you and to deal with those feelings in the moment, rather than having that time away to stew on it. But then equally, if you have a message you want to deliver or a conversation you want to have, that you want the individual to spend some time away from work thinking about it and have that opportunity to really consider what you've said, then maybe a Friday afternoon is a good time. So for example, if you're having a conversation with somebody about their future in the job, let's just say you've got to the point where you feel that their heart's not really in their role, and you want to have a frank discussion with them about their future, it might be an opportunity to do that on a Friday afternoon so that they have the weekend to really consider and reflect. So I think timing is important when you tie it to what you want to achieve out of it. And of course, where you have that conversation, it should always be in private. It goes without saying that having conversations of a sensitive nature, or even not a sensitive nature, about performance or behaviour, that kind of thing, should never take place in front of colleagues or customers or in a public area. They should always be done in private, respecting the individual and how the individual may feel about what you're saying to them. So the third thing is, when and where are you going to have that conversation? So when I was putting together the podcast and the information around difficult conversations, I had in mind throughout the message that is being shared by Gary Vaynerchuck. So for those of you who don't follow Gary V or Gary Vaynerchuck, I'll put the links in the show notes so you can find out. But he has been talking a lot recently about kind candour. And I think that if you keep this in mind when you're thinking about difficult conversations, and it underlines all of the things we've just talked about, then I don't think you can go wrong, really. So what is candour? So candour is the quality of being open and honest in expression and frankness. And what Gary V has said is that he was lacking in candour with his employees and people within his organisation. So he would avoid having difficult conversations with people, avoid telling them where they were going wrong. And then when it got to the point where it was sort of the end of the line for them, or things came to a head, and he was then having those conversations, those candorous conversations about performance or their place in the organisation, it was then creating feelings of resentment amongst them and amongst other people in the team, because they were seeing one thing from him and then hearing another. And what he said was he was lacking in this candour because he was worried about the impact on the individual. And so he said he put kind in front of candour, and it's made all the difference. So he says there's a great blog post on his website, which I'll share with you, which relates to his book, which I'll talk about in a moment. But he says, you should be able to speak candidly with your employees about performance, but you should also be able to do so without humiliation or aggression. Just like you have expectations of them, they have to be able to expect a safe culture and environment when they come to work every day. And a quote from his book, which is 12 and a half, Leveraging the Emotional Ingredients Necessary for Business Success. He says, and I love this, just like a good doctor has good bedside manner, a good leader knows how to handle hard conversations with care. Compassionate communication heals everything, and it's when you're the most upset that you actually have to deploy the most kindness and compassion to the person on the other side. So if you think about that quote, and you think about the fact that the person that you're delivering the message to on the other side is another human being, has thoughts, feelings, emotions, all of that sort of thing. And then you deliver that message with compassion and positivity and with the outcome in mind, then you will be a great leader and you will set yourself apart from others. And not only that, you will prevent issues from going further, employment tribunal claims, all sorts of things. So I can't emphasize enough how important I think that kind candour is in your organisation and in your role as a leader or manager of a team. So I just want to round off then with my top tips in relation to dealing with difficult conversations. The first is to prepare by going through the 3 steps that I've described earlier. Try to ensure that the conversation will not come as a surprise to the recipient. And that's where I go back to laying the foundations, dealing with things in the moment, and being honest with people throughout your relationship. Think positively about it. What is the positive that can come from your conversation? Reduce your emotional involvement in the issue. Remember the outcome you're trying to achieve, so take the emotion away from it. And then don't make assumptions about the outcome, how the other person might respond. If you build it up that you think they're going to be aggressive or sad, then you're going to have that in mind when you're talking to them, and your behaviour then may reflect on them and they may behave in that way anyway. So don't build it up, is what I'm saying. Cut out the distractions and make sure you're present in the moment for that conversation. Always choose the most appropriate time for the conversation based on what you want to get out of it, and choose an appropriate location. And just be consistent when you're talking to people. Be consistent in your message and your delivery. And then finally, just to reiterate and highlight that kindness here is key. Regardless of the business objective, regardless of the behaviour, regardless of what's going on, the main thing to remember is that kindness is the key. There is no place as a manager where you can't be kind in delivering any message to your team or member of staff. Now, hopefully you found that episode helpful. And if you would like any further information, or you want to chat through your ways of approaching difficult conversations, or you have any suggestions, you can always leave a comment on the website, which is realemploymentoradvice.co.uk/podcasts. Alternatively, if you would like some training for your team or your managers around difficult conversations, if you'd like us to deliver this to you tailored for your organisation, then we can do that. Don't hesitate to get in touch. My email is alison@realemploymentoradvice.co.uk. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope that you have a fantastic 2 weeks, and I'll be back with another podcast in 2 weeks' time. Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.